third guest that's coming up now is also a new guest that's never been on the show. He has a new book, and his name is Lee Hawkins. And we want to welcome Lee to Black Authors Matter TV.
Hello, it's good to see you.
Same here. And I
Same.
want you to know that you um, came across our radar because one of our company's, well, not one of our company's very best book customer. And we don't even retail books anymore except to specific people because we had a store at one time for 10 years. But anyway, she's been our customer for 22 years. And she listens to NPR and she hears about books. She listens to it every day. And she told us about your book, and then we did some research. And that was why we invited you to the show. That's how it came across our radar, because there are different ways to hear about books. And with so many books being released, a lot of times we get alerts and things like that. But your book sounded really interesting. And do you have a copy of your book with you? I am
Yes, ma'am. It's called I
nobody's
Am
slave.
Nobody's Slave, How Uncovering My Family's History Set Me Free. And
Oh,
please thank that young lady for recommending me to your show because I strongly believe that Black authors matter. And this is the
yes.
audience that I'm trying to get through. I've had a lot of mainstream recognition, but this book
Okay.
I wrote for our people. It's okay for people from outside our community to read our literature, but this was a book that I really wanted to write for the liberation, the internal liberation, mentally, spiritually, physically, liberation of modern Black Americans who descend from slavery.
Okay. And it just says she lives in New York and she's in her 80s. The lady that
Amen.
recommended. Yeah.
Okay.
She buys books. It's amazing. And she gives them away to people. She's loves books, mostly nonfiction. And really the fiction that she likes is historical fiction, which is really like real life. But she does that. So tell us about is this your first book? Is this your
Yes,
debut book?
ma'am.
Well,
Yes.
congratulations on that. Now,
Thank you.
before you decided to do this book, what did you do every day? What was your profession? Or what has been
Well,
your profession?
most recently, I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal for
Oh,
19 years,
okay.
and covering business. I
Mhm.
covered a lot of different beats there. I did a lot of interviews on camera as well, but also covered General Motors. I covered during the pandemic the New York public schools for 2 years because at that point I was very interested in the long term effects of childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences on Black and Brown children. And I wanted to see how that would manifest in the pandemic. And so I was blessed to be able to cover the New York public schools, which is only 15% white students. And it's the nation's largest school district. And so with over 1 million kids at the time. And so I covered that. And I also was a member of the team of Black reporters, mainly Black reporters, who came together at the Wall Street Journal to write a a series on the Tulsa massacre of 1921. And because I come to this experience through writing about intergenerational effects of slavery and Jim Crow on modern Black people, most of the work I do is through the lens of intergenerational. And so I did a story with my colleague called The Dreams of Jack and Daisy Scott. And that story showed how the Tulsa massacre affected the family for 3 generations after, to give
Okay.
people a sense of how these atrocities that were committed against our people, despite the fact that we thrived, despite it, how we still carry some of the effects and how it affected our families and sometimes splintered our families, um, and that toll that took. And so for me, I've always been curious about the world, and it's rooted in being, I talk a lot about in the book about getting whoopings as a kid and how conflicted I was about that. And a lot of my whoopings came from being curious. I came from a family with a father who loved me dearly, uh, and he was from Greenville, Alabama. He
Okay.
lived, born in 1948, and he moved north when he was 12 because his mother tragically was died, and the decision was made that he would move north to live with a sister and a brother-in-law who had already moved there. But my point is that his mind was very locked in Alabama still. And a lot
Mm.
of the rules of the South were the rules of our home in Minnesota. And so the idea of a child being seen and not heard was prevalent in my family and prevalent in my church community and in my village, that there were just things that, children should stay out of adults' business. And for me, being a curious boy, and just having rational questions and logical questions about certain things. Well, why can't we talk about Alabama? What happened to your mom? Those kinds of questions were the things that got me in trouble. But the things that got me in trouble are the things that are allowing me to make good trouble now.
Okay, well, that's a good way of putting it. Um, now my roots are in the South as well, and I'm
Where?
well, North Carolina. Both of my parents are from North Carolina.
Okay.
They're deceased now, but um, then we moved to Virginia when I was 8 because my father was a pastor. So we would move, he would get a pastor, a bigger church. He was in rural churches in North Carolina. Then when we moved to Virginia, that was where we stayed because he became a pastor of one of the largest Black churches in the area at the time. Um, so I do understand the mores of Southern living, and
And the
I'm in
beauty of it.
Texas now, but I'm not. Well, I actually was born in Texas, but I never lived here until I became an adult and then moved here. But I went to school in Washington. But I say that to say I understand what you're saying about uh, when you use the word whooping. Some people don't realize it's not. People didn't say whipping;
I stay
they
whipping.
said whooping.
Right. When
They
we
didn't
should be
call it
saying,
a whipping; they called it a whooping.
right.
But it was discipline. And
Well,
it was common. Now I don't know what happened once you moved to Minnesota, but it was common. It was common, but it wasn't in my experience. And I was one of those curious kids too, or mischievous. I was curious and mischievous, but it wasn't overused. Now, in some families, I hear about like things people tell me that they got hit with all kinds of things. That wasn't the case in my growing up. It was used, but it wasn't overused. It
I'm
was
happy to hear that.
appropriately used, I would say.
Okay. Well,
But
I would encourage you to read I Am Nobody's Slave. And I hope that we can have a conversation about that later. And if you still feel that way, because what this book does is the reason I had to change from saying whooping to whipping was because I wanted to give the credit where it was due, to where it came from. Because I grew up a lot of times doing things and not really knowing where things came from and believing that certain things came from our heritage. And there were the things that we did before we were um, held in brought here and
still in
held in
captivity.
captivity. Certain things like a black man having babies with multiple women and not taking care of the child. I believed that this was a phenomenon that came from out of the black experience in the 80s, right after all those periods of black excellence. And then our families in the 70s and 80s started to fall apart, and we started to see much more of that. I believe that things like eating chitlins and hog maws and all the things that I used to love, that I used to not want to have collard greens unless I had some pork in there. I thought that the chitlins and things that we used to eat on New Year's Eve, I thought that that came from our heritage. I believe that the belt was something that had to be done to Black children because Black children could not be, you know, we couldn't have any freedom because we could get killed by the police or we could get killed in the streets. But I didn't know where that came from. There were so many things that I didn't know. I didn't know why it was that every time I got an A on an English paper, I felt the need to stuff it away in my backpack because I didn't want the kids to see it because I thought that they would tell me that I was acting white. And when I went into my history, now you got to understand this took 10 years to do. I did an exhaustive, devastating amount of research, applying my skills as an investigative reporter to find out really how can something, this is a question that many of our white brothers and sisters love to ask. Well, how can something that happened 150 years ago affect a Black person today? Well, instead of giving lip service, I said, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to find out. I'm going to trace my family history 400 years. And I'm going to find out what the truth is about all of these Black people who are walking around, who have become mayors of cities and CEOs of companies and entrepreneurs and UPS drivers and nurses and all of us who walk around with such pride and dignity like nothing ever happened to us, making it look so easy. And I wanted to show what generationally this slavery and Jim Crow did to my family and how it was that we're still standing and that we're still thriving and that we never found the language to talk about what we went through. And when I look at my father, when I look at my father, I loved him so much. And his sisters, who lived in Alabama, and like I said, moved to Minnesota in tragic circumstances. When I look at them, I know that the reason they didn't talk about Alabama, I know now because I got to go into my heritage and I got to go into the things that they all survived. And I saw that since 1837, I've had a family member murdered every generation, including my grandfather and both of my great grandfathers. What were they murdered over mainly? Success, land, and livestock, just like the Tulsa Massacre. Um,
Mm.
just like all of the things we've seen. And I also found out that the whipping culture, and I call it that I need to use the right word because it was whipping. And it was used on my great great grandmother, Charity Pugh, which I actually had no idea who she was. And then when I began to do this research, I realized that she was a woman that my granduncle used to tell us about, his grandmother. And I realized that we knew the last generation of people who were enslaved. And I pieced together her life. And I saw that she was brutally whipped. And she was also a victim of sexual assault, which is why 20% of my blood is DNA is from Wales. And over 90% of Black people in this country today have European blood, foundational Black Americans who descend from slavery. And so many of them have a lot more than me.
Yeah,
How is it that,
to varying degrees. You're right. You're right about that. And not, I
right,
would say 90% of the people who have ancestry in America from the 1800s
right. And so
or before.
the toll that that took on our families and the different secrets and lies that were told out of the embarrassment of being um, related to the enslaver led a lot of people to say that they had Native American or indigenous heritage when they really just had white heritage. And I think that, this isn't just me talking. I mean, this book, it's
No,
been,
it's the common threads.
yeah. And
Mhm.
but the last point I want to make, because I don't want to dominate the interview. It is an
No,
interview.
it's
Um,
an interview about your book. So no, you
right.
do. it's your half hour.
But the last thing that I wanted to say was that um, I never got to meet my great great grandmother. All I did was hear about her secondhand. But one thing that I was told was how mean she was and how she used to beat us in the field when my daddy had his farm if we weren't working fast enough. She was a mean old lady, I was told. And this was an uncle who was in his 90s in 1991. But he never told me that she was enslaved. He just told me that she was a mean old crazy lady.
Mm.
When I pieced her life, when I went back and studied my great great grandfather on my mother's side and my great great grandmother on my father's side, I saw what their life was like day to day. And in particular, Grandma Charity lived under a law called the Slave Code of Alabama of 1852. And this was a code that governed every aspect of Black life, not just enslaved people, but free Black people as well. See, a lot of people say, well, my ancestors were free. We weren't enslaved, but that doesn't mean you were free because they still had to live under the slave code of Alabama, which in many states, slave codes meant Black people couldn't stay for more than 6 months. And if
Sometimes
they
30
stayed long,
days.
right, or they would be
Mm.
put in slave. So you know all of that. So I won't go back over that. But I will say this. When I looked at that slave code and I saw all of the laws that governed us, what was the penalty if it wasn't death? 39 to 100 lashes from the justice of the peace. And when I kept going back into the history, then I saw, wait a minute. So before, you mean to tell me that before these systems were established in America, they were doing this in the United Kingdom? And that their whole system, the justice of the peace system upon which the slave code rested, came from them, that they had an exceedingly violent society of whipping and flogging, and it was brought here. And so Grandma Charity had to live a life where if she left the plantation, she had to have a pass. And if she didn't have a pass, or if four Black people were having a meeting without a Black person, a white person present, that meant everybody got whipped. And who did they get whipped by? By the police? No, they weren't police. Every white man between ages of 18 and 45 had to do 1 night a week of slave duty. And what that meant was they did the slave patrol duty. And it would all of them had a whip and all of them had a gun. So whether you had slaves or enslaved people or not, you were still supporting a governmentally codified system that was set up um, to use violence to extract labor out of our people and to whip our people into passivity. And when I looked at the juvenile court records from the slavery era, but even after that, in the early 1900s, I found a case where a judge had sentenced a young Black boy to go to a juvenile facility. And he said, we can't just send him there. We have to whip that Negro because everybody knows the character of a Negro and that they only respond to the lash. And when I found that out, when I saw that, and when I saw that reading and writing was something that Black people would be getting 39 to 100 lashes for reading, I then realized why people would call me white when I got the A's on the paper. Because I started to understand that a lot of these beliefs are rooted in the American heirloom. That whipping is a part of a colonial society, and not just whipping, but the idea that we're going to feed the Black people the the intestines, the idea that a Black person should never read, that going into a library would be a crime. that they could be punished or maybe even killed for. And when you really start to see it, you start to see how the government codified this system that our ancestors lived under. So why then would a woman who was enslaved for 25 years in bondage, who was sexually assaulted and all of these things, and whipped at the end of the day if she didn't meet her quota on the cotton production, when her son got a farm, why wouldn't she take on the role of the overseer? Black people are not superhuman or subhuman. We have the same psychological effects that anybody who goes through trauma goes through. We're not built more for trauma. And so this book opened my eyes. Studying this book opened my eyes to see the modern connections and to understand, not to judge my parents for the brutality. And you'll see in the book that there's a situation that's really, really tragic that happened to me as a child as a result of discipline, but not to judge my parents through that lens, and to understand that the normalization of all of this led us to internalize a lot of these things and take ownership of pathologies that were not ours, that came from white people. And I think this book is not meant to beat anybody over the head with the history that everybody's trying to run from. It's really telling the truth about the history through the story of one Black American boy and one Black American family, a devastating account of truth, to the point that I hope this is an American classic, because we need our children to know from whence we came and the fact that we thrived, not always because of America, but most often despite America.
Okay, I do have a question. Are both sides of your family from Alabama?
No, my father's side is from Alabama, and my mother's side, that great great grandfather who was enslaved for 16 years and then ran away and enlisted in the Civil War and was wounded in the Civil War. So this is a man who went through bondage and then a Civil War, okay? And then he started a farm. And when he started a farm, the discipline was whipping his children with the leather from the horse's harness. Now, where do you think he got that from? But my great grandfather, that was his childhood. And that was what he chose to do with his children. They built beautiful farms. They moved to South Dakota, and they were some of the first Black people in South Dakota. The Blakey family, they're written about in books, and they were titans. I'm so proud of my family's legacy. But the one thing that was really hard was the legacy of slavery and a lot of the different things that um, made childhoods traumatic because of a lot of the things that weren't confronted. For instance, that great great grandfather from Missouri, I found the ad that says at the top, public sale of Negroes, and he's listed as a 10-year-old boy. And in that ad, we see why my family to this day, when we have a family reunion, we have 3 different last names, but we're from the same family. How is that? Because of that transaction in 1858, when they were all sold and separated from one another. Thank God that my great great grandfather, after the Civil War, went back and found his family. But so yeah, my family, the truth is, foundational Black Americans, a lot of us go back to the South. And like you, I was raised in the church. I spent my whole childhood and a lot of my adult life around gospel music and singing in churches. And for me, that was the power. A lot of people have been have strayed from the church for different reasons, usually because of people, not necessarily because of God. But for me, I trace anything great that I've ever done to that community that I grew up in at Mount Olivet Baptist Church. And I'll tell you, when we walked in to the service, and devotional was coming on. And you remember they would have the elders up in front, and some of those ladies were 90 and 89, and some of them were over 100. You know, Mother Massey, she was the matriarch of our church, and I would walk in and they would be singing, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what they were doing, but I knew that there was something spiritual in those melodies. When I went back and I really studied it, I found out that those were people who were the children and grandchildren of the people who survived slavery and then came out and sharecropped, built farms, and did all of the things that led to the revolt of Reconstruction when they were so jealous of our success. And so I'm just saying that, yeah, my family's from the South, and I love Black people from the South because they haven't gotten the credit for the movement that they led. And there are 8 to 9 million survivors. That's what I call you. If you're from the South before 1964, you lived through not segregation as I was taught, but you lived through apartheid. Apartheid that was not just violent, but a crime against humanity. As I said, I've had a family member murdered every generation since 1837, usually over land or livestock. And our country allowed and codified that violence and has never paid a dime of reparations to the Black people who are living today. Okay, we don't have to go back to my great great grandmother. We can go back to my father. We can go back to that 80-year-old woman who recommended my book as she was raised in the South. Those people were not born. I've been here. My family has been here since the 1600s, and I descend from Revolutionary War soldiers and soldiers on both sides of the Civil War. But I'm the first person in my family, first generation, to be born equal to a white person. So we have to, on paper, and so we have to understand that racial equality is a new concept in America. It's only 60 years old. My father was not born equal to a white person, but what do you think he did when he was 18? He enlisted to serve in the United States Air Force at the height of the Vietnam era war. And so we are powerful, patriotic people, and we made it look easy. But this book does not let America go. We have to be complex in our understanding of American history. And this is why books like this are banned.
Okay, so is your book actually banned somewhere? Is on the banned list?
Thank God, no, it hasn't been banned yet. But you know, it's funny because I noticed that it is getting picked up in the South. But, you know, in a lot of the libraries I see, there are, 100 people waiting lists for the book, right? Um, but I haven't broke into school curriculum yet. And that's a different conversation. Right now, there's an assault on books of truth. Some of our greatest classics. There's a group called Moms for Liberty that has waged all kinds of wars to try to get books pulled, to effectively and successfully get books pulled from the curriculum, which I've always said hurts white children more than it hurts our children. Because our children, we're going to get it to them however we need to get it. We're going to pay attention to our history. But the white child who is going into a more diverse culture than their grandparents' America, they're going to have to be the ones to report to a Black person at work, or to have a Black professor, or to have a Black neighbor. And if they get all clammy and are nervous because they grew up in a homogenous society and neighborhood in a gated community, they won't be able to compete in this world. So it's not just about altruism, it's about capitalism. If we want our children of all races to thrive, they have to be able to survive in a diverse culture, which is the whole reason why this whole DEI, anti-DEI initiative isn't good for anyone, because it basically makes it harder for people who lived in a hyper-segregated environment to be able to thrive when they get into the real world.
Well, Lee, you have given us a lot to think about, and congratulations to you on tracing your family's history
Thank you.
so far back. That's not everybody has been able to do that. So, your book is available wherever books are sold, and it's called
I
I
am
Am
nobody's
Nobody's
slave.
Slave.
How uncovering my family's history set me free. And I am encouraging this book because it encourages people to have conversations in families that we need to have. You know, whether it's about somebody, different tragedies and traumas that happen, and all of the beautiful resilience and things that were accomplished that we're often not able to hear from or hear about, because many of our elders won't talk about what they lived through, and we miss out a lot. And I guess the last thing I'll say, besides thank you for this prestigious opportunity to appear on your show, is that I also want to build bridges between those of us who grew up in the North and those of us who were from the South and didn't get the opportunity, those of us in the North sometimes, to go down and stay with grandma or auntie and grandpa and uncle, and spend the summer in the South. And what that did was it separated our families again. The Great Migration separated a lot of Black families, where you have family members all over the country and you don't know half of them. And so, what this book does is to try to bring people together through understanding the power of our people, the resilience of our people, the empowerment of our people, and how we can use family history to unite each other. It's called the Future Method: Family Unity through Understanding Roots and Experiences, and
Okay.
not being
Well,
afraid
a
to
lot of
stand
Black people are
up.
moving back south too.
Yes, I
Since
see.
then, a
I
lot
see
of
why.
people, yeah, that's happening a lot. Well, my last guest is in the queue, and so we need to end the interview. But congratulations on your work, and you are. I know it's very gratifying when something you worked on for a long time is you can say, "This is it. It's in my hands," and show it to people and share it with people.
God is good. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, and continued success.
Oh, you too. Keep doing
Okay.
the great work.
All
Thank you,
right.
Seth.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.